In this week's episode of Serenbe Stories, we're sharing an interview that Steve Nygren gave on the Glowing Older podcast alongside their host, Nancy Griffin. Serenbe has big plans to break ground on a state-of-the-art aging-in-place campus designed to take down the barriers that often leave older generations siloed away from the greater community. This campus will have no gates, no locked-away areas, and interestingly enough, no age restrictions. It will also be located in the heart of Serenbe's Mado hamlet. Connected to shops and restaurants, the new Acton Academy school campus, and plenty of health and wellness businesses and services. In this interview, hear about Steve's approach to aging in place, intergenerational living, and how it all ties back to his biophilic vision for the community.
There's plenty of statistics that show health is tied to our connection to nature and to one another. And we have been building places that separate us from both.
Welcome to the Glowing Older podcast, where we interview experts on innovation in the business of aging well. I'm your host, Nancy Griffin, and it's such a pleasure to be here today with Steve Nygren, founder and CEO of Serenbe. Welcome to the program, Steve.
Thank you.
Well, before we dig into Serenbe, please tell us about your background.
I grew up on a farm in Colorado, part of a generational Scandinavian family that settled Boulder County in the mid-1800s. Being a farm kid, I could hardly wait to leave the farm, and went to the University of Colorado, not too many miles from where I grew up. And started out in architecture, was seduced into the hospitality field, worked for Stouffer's several years in their hotel opening program. They moved me to Atlanta, Georgia. I fell in love with Atlanta in the 70s, early 70s, realized it was a city on fire to exciting things happening. And I stepped off that corporate treadmill to open my first restaurant, built that to 36 restaurants, and sold that in 94 and moved to our weekend farm right on the southwest edge of Atlanta. Our children at that point were 6, 8, and 10. And in my 6th year of retirement, I became concerned about urban sprawl, and that led to the Serenbe story.
Well, I've been a huge fan of Serenbe since your inception. So tell us about where the project began and where you are today.
We started looking at models let me back up a moment. I should say when we became concerned about the threat and various things happened, I did what a lot of people do when you start buying land. We had 300 acres at that point, and in a 5-week period in my panic, I had 600 additional acres that attached us under contract. All sorts of reasons people were willing to sell. One had been in a family for 3 generations, another 2, another just 30 years. And so it seemed to be something incredible was happening, whatever the forces be, that we acquired that. But I realized that 900 acres in the path of urban sprawl really was not protected. And I couldn't keep showing up at these closings to buy land. We looked for a moment to do a model to really change the zoning in this section of Metro Atlanta, and realized a lot of times models don't work. They actually attract traditional development that they're trying to change. And so I spent the next 2 years bringing 500 landowners together, both pro-development and pro-preservation, to look at a new vision. We used the countryside of England as our model because after World War II, they had good land laws because they couldn't afford the urban sprawl. And so using that model, we brought English land law results to a property rights southern state, working with universities to do that. So we passed that legislation in 2002. We needed some state regulations for transfer development rights, which we passed in 2003, and we broke ground on Serenbe in 2004.
Well, I know it's been touted as the original and first ever true wellness community in the United States. So where are you today in terms of how many houses and just the infrastructure of Serenbe?
Today, we are at about 500 houses, about 80 in development and under construction, infrastructure going in for another 380. We have 5 restaurants, a country inn, about 35 businesses operating here. And we looked at what are the core values that builds community. I looked to how we in the United States lived pre-1930, when it was more a sense of community and not dependent on the automobile. And in that period, generally, most people lived in towns or in the country. And if you lived in town, you could connect to nature. And many people knew the farmer growing part of their food, and their food was more regional systems. So that was part of the basis we looked at. In our zoning, 70% of the land that's developed has to remain in agricultural use. Now, that can be farms, that can be equestrian, that can be forest, it can be any of those things. Well, this is an entire different lifestyle. It's not only fresh air, better food, a relationship with nature. So that's one of the components of the four. Another is art. I looked at great places through centuries. There was always an art patron, if it was the church or a family. And that's kind of disappeared from our culture today. In fact, we're taking art funding out of schools and public buildings. And so we wanted to find a way to make art a key core. And so art's important. We employ artists, we employ craftsmen, but we also formed an institute, and there is a 1% transfer fee on every house sold or resold, 3% if it's a vacant lot. We're now contributing well over $1 million for art and environmental programming every year. And that will grow every year as we sell more houses. And then there's always, resales that will happen into the future. So that gives our artists a permanent base of funding to where they're not always having to raise money to stay alive. And we're able to bring some incredible national, international talent to Serenbe. And then education is a key thing. And a lot of components to education. Our community established a charter school, which is now a real model based off the work of Richard Louv, Last Child in the Woods. These are cottages in the woods, 500 children going to that school. Acton Academy is a Montessori-based school growing out of literally a residence basement. And they are just completing a multi-million-dollar campus for 450 students, 220 currently enrolled, and that is on the campus. It's all geothermal. It has the first Tesla solar shingles on any commercial building in the world, and they will be totally self-sustaining from an energy standpoint, and the kids will be able to see how their building is monitored. And then the fourth is health and wellness. 5 years ago, broke ground on the community with that focus. One of our key areas first was a 23,000 square foot office building. It has the gym, the cycling center, the dentist, the physical therapies, Chinese medicine, yoga, medical practitioner, pediatrician. But what's more, we have 16 live works. That is where you have the shop, the office on the street level, and then there's residences above. And many of these are 1 or 2 apartments above the shop. Some of those are purely owned by investments for people that live here, and they lease all 3 revenue streams out. Others, such as our small animal vet operation is on the street level, and then she, with her family, lives on the top 2 floors. And we are getting ready. In February, we'll break ground on an aging in place campus, very different from what we see in America. Be Advice that did the Hedwicke facility in the Netherlands, a lot of press on them for their dementia village. Even as progressive as that was for that time and is now for America, certainly, with their help and other consultants, we're taking it another step further and really decoupling a stigma about aging. And so there will be, not only will there be no gates or locks, but there are no age restrictions. People need various services at any age as you age, depending on health events that happen. And so we're not tagging it to a specific age along our spectrum of aging, but need or lifestyle based, if you will.
I'm a big fan of these intergenerational concepts, this 55 plus and segregating away from different generations seems like an outdated model. But why is intergenerational living such an important part of the Serenbe experience?
Hear the laughter of children from your front porch. It generally puts a smile on your face. And there's plenty of statistics that show health is tied to our connection to nature and to one another. And we have been building places that separate us from both, especially the bookends of our community. If you look around, I think you could say we put our kids and our elders in prisons. And I believe the pandemic brought a focus to that, and we saw the reality of that.
Yeah, so it's the connection to nature and each other that makes Serenbe so special. So tell us about the biophilic elements at Serenbe and how that enhances quality of life.
When we really started looking at how to tag us, everyone wants just naturally to want to be able to identify with a word. And after the recession, when some of the financial analysts started looking at the places who had stepped out of the recession early, it was walkable communities and environmental communities. And so we had more interest. And people would identify us as new urbanism. And because of our density, we are new urbanists, but all new urbanists aren't necessarily environmental. And so that didn't totally fit us. The Urban Land Institute has a published book on the 10 environmental communities in America, and we're one of those 10, but we're the only one with density. And then when a New York reporter was doing a story on the fact that we had put houses right on the edge of our farm, which was unusual 20 years ago, not unusual 100 years ago, she called it an agrihood. And now we are recognized as having launched kind of that agrihood movement. And so we said, well, what we really are is a biophilic design community. Biophilia was being taught at Yale and UVA, but no one was really applying it on a community development scale. And so that's where we identified ourselves. About 10 years ago, we formed the Biophilic Institute for thought leaders in this field, both in education and city planning. That conference is held each April. But it's a connection of all living systems, the love of all living systems. That's the humans, the animals, the fauna, everything that is alive, and we relate to it. And we're stronger and happier and thus healthier when we understand that connection.
Well, you mentioned back 2002 and 2003 was when you came up with this vision for Serenbe. Why do you think there are not more Serenbes around the country? Because you've remained unique.
Well, there's two things. For whatever reason, since 1950, as we're trying to do all the housing, we have sanitized our zoning regulations to the point that we've taken the vitality out of where we live. We have one intersection at Serenbe that I believe remains illegal in most zoning codes today. It has single-family houses and across the street attached townhouses. And then you have Live Works on another quadrant of the section. That's with the shop downstairs and the residence upstairs. And then the coffee shop, the commercial. And they're all in one intersection. Now, that was common in 1930s and before. Most cities had those in your neighborhoods. But we have gradually zoned those out. We don't think commercial uses should be across from residences. We have a tendency to put all the same kind of residences in the same down cul-de-sac by price or by size. And we have just so segregated and sanitized the regulatory system that we've taken that vitality out, and that's a piece of it. And as a result, we've ended up with what I call rut thinking. We keep doing the same thing. Now, part of that is our financial institutions require feasibility studies. Feasibility studies are based on looking through the rearview mirror. And so if you're out there looking through the windshield, cutting new territory for this period of time, there are a lot of roadblocks. And many developers do not have the passion, the patience, or the ability, because many of them have borrowed money and the interest clock is ticking and they don't have the time to fight and change the regulations. Luckily, I had the luxury to do that. I wasn't doing this as a developer. I was doing this to save the land and to create a more responsible model. And as I dug into that, I realized this wasn't this tough. It just looks back 100 years. How did we live when things were simpler and we were more connected to both each other and to nature?
Well, it makes sense that you've become an example for what the country could aspire to if they weren't stuck in so many of these institutional models, which, of course, senior living is deeply entrenched in institutional. So you mentioned Hedwige, which is the famed dementia village in the Netherlands, and that you were borrowing some things from that in your aging in place community that you're currently planning. What are some of the things you're borrowing? I know this Hedwige is a dementia village, and this aging in place is much more than just memory care. But what are you borrowing from that?
Well, the way we physically design one thing is you have sub-communities. So for every 10 to 12 apartments, there's a gathering room. Now, that's not going to be necessarily restricted to those 10 to 12 apartments, but it'll be naturally to gather there where card tables and what have you will be. So those are natural areas to gather. Then we have what's called, attached cottages. There's 24 cottages that all face into a central courtyard. And so and there is one common space that they will all use. And so that's sort of a sub-community on a larger network. And then we have some scattered independent houses within the campus, another 24 of those. Then we have what we call the House of 8, and that's 6 to 8 efficiency bedrooms, but it's common living space. So they have a common kitchen and a living TV room, might even, if they so vote, to have a common pet. One of those units is occupied by the house parent, if you will, sort of borrowing from college age. So that's the House of 8. Now, we might not have age restrictions. We might have a college student in there, as well as a senior person who actually needs some level of maybe not care, but family maybe is not comfortable with them living totally alone, but they're still very active. So if there is someone who, is having a little bit of a memory loss, rather than lock them up, we want to uncage our elders. And so with wearables, we could have at least 3 wearables and a monitor and, alerts if they're out of certain range, which gives someone who's losing their memory a lot more dignity in how they live, rather than feeling they have done something wrong and they need now be locked behind doors and gates.
Yes. I mean, that traditional model of memory care is really to put them away, literally. So that makes it a whole new ball game. So, Steve, what gets you most excited these days?
Well, this is certainly exciting. We're going to break ground on this campus in February. A lot of things I can't talk about yet, that are relationships with caregivers and how we're segregating these things. So that's very exciting, And in addition to that, we're under development for 2 hotels on the campus, which is going to allow more people to visit. We currently have the Inn at Serenbe, which is very full. And so these added hotel rooms will allow for more visitors and more groups to have their meetings here to actually see what we're doing.
Well, I can't wait to come visit. It's definitely on my bucket list.
Good. Well, come see us.
Well, I would love that, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us today and for all that you're doing for older adults and just for everyone.
Well, yeah, our real goal is that people drive in and they see our free-range kids. So it's free-range kids and uncaged elders is a real goal, and you'll see it happening here.
I love that. I hope to come soon. Thank you so much.
Look forward to talking to you in person.
Me too.